in the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1878, on the blood-soaked soil of the Dakota Territory, a single act of kindness from a child was set to ignite a firestorm. 7-year-old Clementine Garrison, driven by an innocence the land itself had tried to kill, gave her only woolen blanket to a native baby, a child of the very people the settlers of Redemption Creek feared. But this wasn't just any blanket. Its threads were woven with a secret history, a forgotten promise that would turn a simple gift into a declaration of war. What the Lakota tribe did in the hours that followed was not what the town expected. It was something far more terrifying, far more personal, and it would push every man, woman, and child to the edge of annihilation. The wind in the Dakota Territory in January didn't just bite, it gnawed. It was a hungry, living thing that stripped the heat from a man's bones and left behind an ache that settled deep in the marrow. For the settlers of Redemption Creek, a fledgling town that was little more than a muddy street and a collection of desperate dreams. The winter of 1878 was a test of faith issued directly by a silent, indifferent God. Thomas Garrison felt the cold in his soul. Each morning, he'd pull on his stiffened boots, the leather frozen solid, and face the white expanse that had swallowed his homestead. He was a farmer by trade, but a carpenter by necessity. His hands split and raw from both the plow and the saw. He had come west with his wife Martha and their 7-year-old daughter Clementine, chasing the promise of 160 acres of his own land. He had the land now, but it felt less like a gift and more like a sentence. "Thomas, the woodpile's getting low," Martha said, her voice a small cloud in the frigid air of their one-room cabin. She was a woman whittled down by hardship, her face a road map of worry, but her eyes still held a fierce protective fire, especially when they fell on their daughter. Clementine was the single point of warmth in their frozen world. She was a wisp of a girl, with hair the color of late summer wheat, and eyes the clear, startling blue of a prairie sky just after a storm. She possessed an empathy that seemed entirely out of place in such a harsh land. While other children learned to be wary, Clementine learned to be curious. She'd leave saucers of milk out for stray cats that never came, and hum songs to the beleaguered chickens in their coop. Her most prized possession was a blanket. It wasn't large or particularly fine, but it was a riot of color in their drab existence. Woven by her grandmother back in Ohio, it was a patchwork of deep crimsons, forest greens, and a brilliant sunny yellow. It was Clementine's shield against the night, her tent for imaginary adventures, and the one tangible link to a world of comfort and safety she barely remembered. The tension in Redemption Creek was as thick as the frost on the window panes. The Lakota Sioux, whose ancestral lands the settlers were carving up, kept to the frozen hills their presence felt more than seen. They were ghosts in the swirling snow, their hunting parties occasionally spotted as distant figures on a ridge, lean and enduring. To most of the townsfolk, they were a source of primal fear, a boogeyman to whisper about when the wind howled. Stories, mostly exaggerations and outright lies, were traded over watered-down whiskey at the town's only saloon, a rickety establishment run by a man named Benedict Ben Callahan. Callahan was not a homesteader. He was a predator of a different sort, a failed cattle baron with a paunch and a politician's smile. He owned the saloon, the general store, and the mortgage on half the homesteads in the valley. He saw the Lakota not as people, but as an obstacle to his ambition. He wanted the land they hunted on, and he fanned the flames of fear with the skill of a master blacksmith. "Mark my words," he'd say, polishing a glass behind the bar, his voice a low conspiratorial rumble. "They're just biding their time. One day they'll come down from those hills, and it won't be for trade." His two lackeys, a scrawny rat-faced man named Pete and a hulking brute named Jeb, would nod in solemn, drunken agreement. On a Tuesday, the cold deepened. The sky turned a metallic grey, and the air grew so still and frigid it felt like the world was holding its breath. Thomas needed to fetch supplies from Callahan's store, a task he dreaded. It meant leaving Martha and Clementine alone, and it meant facing Callahan's sneering hospitality. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised, kissing Martha's chapped lips. He knelt before Clementine, who was huddled by the small stove, her precious blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You be a good girl for your mother. Stay inside where it's warm." "Yes, Papa," she chirped, her breath misting. The journey to town was brutal. The horse, a sturdy draft named Samson, struggled through the deepening snow. When Thomas finally pushed open the door to the general store, the blast of stale, warm air was a welcome shock. Callahan was there, of course, leaning against the counter. "Garrison," Callahan greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Getting a mite chilly out there. Thought you might have frozen to your own porch." "Just need flour and salt," Thomas said, ignoring the jibe. He wanted to be in and out, but the talk, as it always did, turned to the Lakota. "Saw tracks this morning," Pete piped up from his stool near the pot-bellied stove. "Big party, not 2 miles from the O'Malley place." "They're getting bold," Callahan added, weighing out the flour. "Starving is what it is, and a starving wolf is a desperate wolf." Thomas paid his jaw tight. He hated this talk. He had never had any trouble with the Lakota. He'd seen them from afar, and they'd seen him, and a silent mutual respect for distance had always been maintained. This constant drumbeat of fear felt manufactured, a sickness being deliberately spread by men like Callahan. He was halfway home when he saw her. Just off the barely visible trail, huddled in the meager shelter of a wind-blasted cottonwood, was a Lakota woman. She was young, her face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of pride and desperation. She was trying to shield a bundle in her arms from the relentless wind. As Thomas drew closer, he saw that the bundle was a baby, wrapped in thin, worn animal hide. The baby was terrifyingly still, its tiny face a pale bluish color. The woman's name was Winona. Her husband had been killed by the same sickness that now ravaged their winter camp, a coughing plague that stole the breath and the strength from their people. Food was scarce. She had left the camp in a desperate attempt to find medicinal herbs by the creek bed, but the sudden vicious drop in temperature had trapped her. Her milk had dried up from malnourishment, and her baby little Thang Chang was fading. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct, every warning from the town screamed at him to ride on. "Don't get involved. It's not your business. It's dangerous." He pulled Samson to a halt, the horse's breath pluming like a steam engine. The woman looked up at him, her expression hardening into a mask of defiance. She would not beg. Thomas was a man of few words and even fewer grand gestures. He fumbled in his saddlebag, pulling out a small block of dried beef he'd bought. He dismounted, the snow crunching loudly in the silence, and approached slowly, holding out the food. The woman stared at his outstretched hand, then at his face, searching for a trick. Seeing none, her pride warred with her baby's desperate need. Finally, she nodded a barely perceptible movement and took the food, Her fingers were like ice against his. Thomas wanted to do more, but he didn't know what. He couldn't bring her back to his cabin. Martha would be terrified, and the town would see it as treason. He didn't have a spare blanket. Helpless and ashamed, he mounted Samson and rode away. The image of the freezing baby burned into his mind. He arrived home as the last light bled from the sky, the world turning a deep, bruised purple. He burst into the cabin, shaking from the cold and the encounter. "Thomas, you're back!" Martha cried in relief. Clementine ran to him, but stopped when she saw his face. "What's wrong, Papa?" Thomas didn't answer. He was staring out the small, grimy window, back in the direction from which he'd come. The story tumbled out of him: the woman, the baby, the blue-tinged face. Martha hugged herself, her own fear warring with a mother's pity. "Oh, Thomas, that poor soul. But there was nothing you could do. It's not our fight." But Clementine wasn't listening to the words of caution. She was listening to the image her father had painted. A baby. A cold baby. Her 7-year-old mind didn't understand politics or prejudice or fear of the unknown. It understood cold, and it understood warmth. While her parents spoke in hushed, worried tones, she made a decision. It was simple, pure, and utterly logical to her. She looked at her colorful blanket, folded neatly on her cot. Then she looked at the cabin door. The baby was cold. She had a warm blanket. Before either of her parents could react, Clementine grabbed her prized possession, unlatched the heavy door, and slipped out into the deepening twilight. "Clementine!" Martha shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. Thomas swore, his blood running cold for a different reason now. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall and plunged out the door after her, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The wind tore at him, and the snow, now falling heavily, immediately began to obscure the small footprints leading away from the cabin, straight toward the lone cottonwood tree on the trail. The world outside the cabin was a maelstrom of white. Snow swirled in a disorienting dance, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. For Clementine, it was a terrifying wonderland. She clutched her woolen blanket to her chest, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the monochrome fury around her. She wasn't thinking about the danger. She was focused on a single, powerful image: a cold baby. She followed her father's horse tracks, her small legs sinking deep into the fresh powder with every step. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath and numbing her cheeks, but she pushed on, driven by a purpose so clear it eclipsed all fear. Thomas, a few hundred yards behind her, was in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. "Clementine, get back here!" he roared, his voice snatched away by the wind. He could barely see her, a small, dark shape against the snow, and the thought of losing her in the blizzard sent a spear of ice through his heart. Clementine finally reached the cottonwood tree. Winona was still there, a statue of despair, her body curled around her baby in a futile attempt to share a warmth she no longer possessed. She looked up as Clementine approached, her eyes wary. She saw the small, pale-haired child, her face flushed from the cold, holding a brightly colored blanket. Clementine didn't say a word. She didn't know any Lakota words, and her English words would have been meaningless. Instead, she acted. With the solemnity of a priestess at an altar, she unfolded her grandmother's blanket and gently, carefully draped it over Winona's shoulders, making sure it enveloped the tiny, still bundle in her arms. The wool was thick, its colors impossibly bright against the gray twilight. For a moment, neither of them moved. Winona stared at the child, her hardened expression crumbling into disbelief. She touched the fabric, feeling the immediate promise of warmth soak through her thin tunic. She looked down at her baby Thang Chang and saw that the blanket was not merely covering him, but swaddling him in a cocoon of vibrant life. Then Winona's eyes locked on a specific patch of the blanket, a square woven with a pattern of a soaring raven against a field of sunny yellow. Her breath caught in her throat. It was not just a pattern. It was a sigil, a specific design she recognized with a jolt that had nothing to do with the cold. Before the moment could be processed, Thomas crashed through the snow, his rifle held at the ready. He saw his daughter standing perilously close to the Lakota woman and skidded to a halt, raising the weapon. "Clementine, get away from her. Now." Winona flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around her baby, her eyes flashing with renewed fear and defiance. But Clementine didn't run. She simply turned to her father, her expression calm. "The baby was cold, Papa." The simple, unassailable logic of it disarmed him. He lowered the rifle, his anger and fear dissolving into a profound, aching confusion. He looked from his daughter's innocent face to the Lakota woman's stunned one, to the impossible splash of color from the blanket against the bleak landscape. We have to go," he stammered, grabbing Clementine's hand. "Now." He pulled her away, casting one last look back at the woman under the tree, now a huddled shape of crimson and green against the snow. The journey back to the cabin was a silent one. Clementine was content, her mission accomplished. Thomas was a wreck of conflicting emotions. When they stumbled back through the door, Martha enveloped Clementine in a frantic embrace, checking her for frostbite, her face wet with tears of relief and terror. "What were you thinking? You could have been killed or frozen to death," Martha sobbed, holding her daughter tight. "Her blanket," Thomas said, his voice hollow, as he stared into the fire. She gave her the blanket. The reality of the act settled over the small cabin. It wasn't just a gift. In the tense climate of Redemption Creek, it was a profound and dangerous statement. They spent a restless night, the wind rattling the cabin walls like an angry spirit, each gust sounding like a footstep, each shadow looking like a warrior. Meanwhile, under the cottonwood tree, a small miracle was happening. The thick wool of the blanket blocked the wind and trapped the last vestiges of Winona's body heat. Slowly, a faint warmth began to return to the baby Thang Chang. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his body, and then he let out a weak, mewling cry. It was the most beautiful sound Winona had ever heard. Bolstered by the dried beef and the impossible hope the blanket represented, she found the strength to stand. She knew she had to get back to her people. She had a story to tell. The next morning, the news spread through Redemption Creek like a contagion carried on the tongue of Pete, who had been out checking his traps and had seen Thomas's frantic return from the trail. Of course, the story he told was not the one that had happened. "Garrison's girl out there consorting with the savages," he announced in Callahan's saloon. "Saw it myself, giving them supplies right out in the open." Callahan seized the opportunity like a starving dog on a stake. "You see," he boomed to the assembled patrons, "I told you all. They're not just starving, they're testing us, seeing how bold they can be, sending their women and children right up to our doorsteps. What's next? They're warriors." Fear, cold and sharp, trickled through the town. The story of Clementine's blanket was twisted into an act of betrayal. Thomas Garrison, by allowing it, had endangered them all. He had shown weakness, and weakness invited attack. Felix Marchand, a weary man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much violence in the Civil War tried to inject some reason. "Now hold on, Ben. We don't know the whole story. Thomas Garrison is a good man." "A good man who's putting our children at risk," Callahan countered, his voice rising with theatrical outrage. "They took the blanket. What do you think that means? It means they'll be back for more. For our food, for our livestock, for our women." The poison worked. A mob mentality began to fester. Men who were usually decent, God-fearing farmers started looking at their rifles with a new purpose. The Garrisons felt the shift immediately. When Thomas went to the well, conversations stopped. Neighbors turned their backs. The isolation of the prairie had become the ostracism of their own kind. Martha wept, convinced they were doomed. Thomas, consumed by guilt and a simmering rage at the town's ignorance, fortified the cabin, barring the door and windows. 2 days passed in a state of siege. Then on the third morning they came. Clementine was the first to see them. She was peering through a crack in the shutters when she saw the figures emerge from the tree line at the edge of their property. Not 1, but 5 Lakota warriors on horseback. They were not painted for war, but their presence was overwhelming, an undeniable statement of power. They sat on their horses still as the winter air, their breath pluming around them. At their lead was a man with a face like carved granite, his long hair streaked with gray. This was Chief Kanji, the Raven. Beside him rode a younger man, his face a mask of fierce pride and suspicion. This was his son, Chaitan the Falcon. Thomas's blood turned to ice. "Martha, get it down," he hissed, grabbing his rifle. This was it. Callahan was right. They had come back. The warriors dismounted, moving with a fluid grace that was unnerving. They did not rush the cabin. They walked slowly, deliberately, stopping about 50 yards from the door. Chief Kanji held up an empty hand, a sign of peace. But to the terrified family inside it, meant nothing. Then Chaitan stepped forward. He called out, his voice clear and strong in the cold air, in words the Garrisons could not understand. He was not threatening. He was announcing their purpose. Inside, Martha was praying her words, a frantic whisper. Thomas had his rifle aimed at the chief's chest, his finger trembling on the trigger. He was ready to die, defending his family. Then the unthinkable happened. Chaitan and another warrior walked back to their horses. They returned not with weapons, but with gifts, several thick, luxurious buffalo hides and a side of fresh venison. They laid them carefully on the snow. Chief Kanji spoke, his voice low and resonant, a sound of authority and ancient wisdom. He held something up. It was not a weapon. It was Clementine's blanket. The colors seemed to burn against the white snow. He then pointed not at the gifts, not at Thomas, but directly at the cabin window, where he knew the small girl was watching. And then he pointed at the blanket, and then back at the window. He was trying to communicate something vital. But Thomas, blinded by fear, and the town's poison, misunderstood completely. He saw it as a taunt. "We have your daughter's blanket. We have a piece of her. Now we've come for the rest." Suddenly, Chaitan strode purposefully towards the cabin door. He was not aggressive, but his approach was swift and uncompromising. "That's far enough," Thomas bellowed from inside. Chaitan did not stop. He had his orders from his father. They had come to show honor, and the first step was to bring the child who had performed the sacred act. Thomas's nerve broke. He fired his rifle not at Chaitan, but into the air beside him. A warning shot. The crack echoed across the silent valley. The warriors tensed. Chaitan froze his hand, flying to the knife at his belt. An insult. A grave insult. Chief Kanji held up his hand again, stopping his son. His face was grim. The white men were more afraid than he had realized. This required a different approach. He gave a sharp command. Before Thomas could reload or Martha could scream, 2 warriors broke from the group, circling to the back of the cabin. There was the sound of splintering wood as they smashed the single, small rear window. Thomas spun around, but it was too late. A warrior, swift as a shadow, was already halfway inside. Thomas clubbed him with the butt of his rifle, but another was right behind him. While Thomas was occupied, Chaitan kicked the front door, the bar splintering under the force of his boot. He stormed in eyes blazing. Martha screamed and threw herself in front of Clementine. Chaitan shoved her aside, not with malice but with an unstoppable sense of purpose. He scooped the terrified, shrieking Clementine up into his arms. He didn't harm her. He didn't even hold her roughly. But he took her. Thomas roared with rage and despair, fighting off the warrior inside. But by the time he scrambled free, Chaitan was already back outside, mounting his horse with Clementine held securely in front of him. "No, my baby godarm, no!" Martha wailed, collapsing in the doorway. Thomas ran out into the snow, weaponless and helpless, and watched as the 5 Lakota warriors turned and rode away, taking his daughter with them, disappearing back into the frozen hills from which they had come. The gifts of hides and venison lay untouched in the snow, a baffling, cruel mockery of the horror that had just occurred. His world had not just ended. It had been stolen. The ride was a blur of terror for Clementine. The world was a dizzying mix of cold wind, the scent of horse and leather, and the iron-strong arm of Chaitan holding her fast. She wept, calling for her papa, her small cries swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Chaitan did not speak to her. His face set like stone, his focus entirely on the treacherous path back to their winter camp. To him, this was not a kidnapping. It was a necessary, honorable retrieval. The girl was a key, and her fear was an unfortunate but unavoidable complication. They arrived at the Lakota camp as dusk began to settle. It was nestled in a hidden valley, sheltered from the worst of the wind by towering pines and granite cliffs. Smoke rose from the tops of a dozen teepees, the only sign of life in the frozen landscape. The camp was not the savage, chaotic place of Ben Callahan's stories. It was quiet, orderly, and imbued with a deep communal sorrow. The coughing sickness had taken its toll. The faces of the people who emerged to see the returning party were gaunt and weary. But their weariness turned to murmurs of excitement and awe when they saw Chaitan dismount with the small, pale-haired girl. Chief Kanji took Clementine from his son's arms. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He looked into her tear-streaked, terrified face, and his own expression softened with something akin to pity. He spoke to her in the soft, flowing cadence of the Lakota language words of reassurance she couldn't understand, but whose tone was undeniably kind. He carried her, not to a prison, but to his own large teepee at the center of the camp. Inside a fire burned brightly, casting warm, dancing shadows on the painted hides that lined the interior. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and sage. Waiting inside was Winona, the woman from the cottonwood tree. Her baby Thang Chung was asleep in a cradleboard, his breathing now steady and even. Upon seeing Winona, Clementine's fear gave way to confusion. Winona knelt before her and offered a small, shy smile. She gestured to the sleeping baby, and then touched her own heart, her eyes full of a gratitude so profound it needed no words. Chief Kanji set Clementine down on a thick, warm buffalo robe near the fire. He then went to a large, painted leather chest at the back of the teepee. From it, he reverently took out Clementine's blanket. He didn't just lay it down. He unfurled it with the care a man might use to handle a sacred scroll. He held it up so the firelight illuminated the vibrant patterns. He began to speak, his voice a low, powerful rumble. Winona, who had learned some English from a missionary years ago, began to translate in hesitant, careful phrases. "He is Chief Kanji," she began. "He thanks you. You saved my son." She pointed to Thang Chang. "You saved us." Kanji then pointed to the specific patch on the blanket, the one with the soaring raven against the yellow field. He spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "This blanket," Winona translated, her eyes wide with the importance of the story. "This was made by his wife, Mourning Dove. She is gone to the spirit world many winters ago." The story tumbled out a piece of tribal history wrapped in simple woolen threads. Mourning Dove had been a weaver of singular skill, her patterns telling stories. The raven was Kanji's symbol. The yellow was the color of the sun of life and hope. This blanket had been her last gift to him, before a sickness took her long before Clementine was even born. Years ago, during a raid by a rival tribe, the Crows, the blanket had been stolen. Kanji had mourned its loss, not as a possession, but as the loss of his wife's last touch, her last breath woven into the fabric. They had assumed it was lost forever. A memory faded into the painful past. How it had journeyed from the hands of a Crow warrior to a trader and eventually to a market in Ohio, where Clementine's grandmother had bought it for its unusual beauty, was a mystery of the twisting paths of fate. But its return was no mystery to them. It was a sign. "The Great Spirit Wakan Tanka works in ways we do not see," Winona said, translating her chief's solemn words. "He sent a great sickness to our people. He sent a great cold to freeze the land. But he also sent a child with the sun in her hair, guided by a pure heart, to return this sacred memory to us. It is a sign that we will endure. That hope is not lost." Clementine, huddled by the fire, understood only fragments of the tale. But she understood the reverence in their voices. She understood she was not a prisoner. She was something else, an honored guest. They fed her a warm, rich stew. Winona gave her a small, carved wooden horse to play with. The fear began to recede, replaced by a child's profound and accepting curiosity. Back at the garrison homestead, there was only black despair. Martha was inconsolable, weeping until she had no tears left. Thomas was a ghost pacing the cabin, his mind a carousel of horrors. He had failed. His pride, his fear had cost him his daughter. The untouched gifts in the snow were a searing indictment of his own prejudice. The news of Clementine's abduction hit Redemption Creek like a lightning strike. Thomas, his face a mask of grief, stumbled into town at dawn, his story a choked, desperate plea for help. This was the moment Ben Callahan had been waiting for. "They've crossed the line," he roared, standing on a crate outside his saloon. A crowd of frightened, angry townsfolk had gathered, their faces pale in the cold morning light. "They've stolen a white child, an innocent girl. This is not a grievance. This is an act of war." "We have to get her back," someone shouted. "Get her back!" Callahan scoffed, his voice dripping with scorn. "We have to do more than that. We have to end this threat once and for all. We need to form a posse ride to that camp and wipe it from the face of God's green earth." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Men ran for their guns, their fear expertly molded into righteous fury by Callahan's words. Felix Marchand pushed his way through the mob, his face grim. "Ben, this is madness. You'll get everyone killed, including the girl. We need to parley, not slaughter." "Parley," Callahan spat. "There's no talking to these animals, Marchand. They understand one thing. Force. Are you with us, or are you with them?" He jabbed a finger toward the hills, and the crowd turned on the Felix, their eyes full of suspicion. Thomas Garrison stood apart, hollowed out. He wanted his daughter back more than he wanted his next breath, but the thought of a massacre of Clementine, caught in the crossfire, was a fresh hell. He saw the bloodlust in the eyes of his neighbors, and he recognized it for what it was, the same blind fear that had made him fire his warning shot. "No," Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the noise. All eyes turned to him. "No posse. Not to kill." He looked at Felix Marchand, a desperate appeal in his eyes. "You said, parley. Let's try to talk to them. I'll go. I'll trade myself for her if I have to." Callahan laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "Listen to him. The man who invited the fox into his henhouse now wants to reason with it. It's too late for talk, Garrison. We ride today." Felix Marchand put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Your heart's in the right place, son. But he's got them. The fever has taken hold." Marchand was a lawman, but he knew he couldn't arrest an entire town. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The posse formed quickly. Nearly 30 men armed with rifles, shotguns, and a terrifying certainty. Callahan, astride a large black stallion, appointed himself leader. He allowed Thomas and Felix Marchand to come along less out of compassion and more to keep them under his watch. The ride was tense and grim. They followed the tracks in the snow, a clear path leading into the heart of Lakota territory. Thomas rode in a fog of dread, the hope of a peaceful resolution dwindling with every mile. He was riding with a lynch mob, and he was powerless to stop them. They found the camp late in the afternoon. From a high ridge, they looked down into the hidden valley. It was just as Clementine had seen it, quiet, sheltered, a handful of tipis, smoking peacefully in the cold air. It didn't look like a war camp. It looked like a village of families trying to survive. "There they are," Callahan hissed, his eyes gleaming. "The Viper's Nest. Jeb Pete take 5 men and circle around to the south. No one gets out. When I give the signal, we open fire from all sides. Don't waste bullets on the women till the warriors are down." "Wait," Felix Marchand protested. "We don't even know if the girl's alive. We can't just start shooting." "She's a casualty of war, Felix," Callahan said coldly. "A necessary sacrifice to ensure the safety of all the other children in this valley." Thomas felt something snap inside him. This wasn't about his daughter. It was never about his daughter. It was about land greed and hate. He spurred his horse forward, breaking from the group and starting down the steep path toward the camp. "Garrison, get back here," Callahan bellowed. "I'm going to talk to them," Thomas yelled back over his shoulder, his voice raw with desperation. "If you open fire, you will be murdering me along with them." His desperate, suicidal act gave the posse pause. Firing now would mean killing one of their own in cold blood. Felix Marchand seized the moment. "Hold your fire. Let's see what he can do," he commanded, pulling his own pistol and glaring at Callahan. Reluctantly, Callahan held up a hand, signaling his men to wait. He could afford a few minutes of drama. Thomas rode into the clearing in front of the Lakota camp. The alarm was raised instantly. Warriors emerged from the teepees, grabbing bows and the few old rifles they possessed. They took up defensive positions, their faces grim. Chaitin appeared, his expression a mixture of contempt and anger at the sight of the armed men on the ridge. Then Chief Kanji emerged from his teepee. He saw Thomas, the lone rider, and then looked up at the posse ringing the valley. He understood immediately. His attempt at honor had been interpreted as an act of war. He held up his empty hand, calling out in his own language for his men to hold their positions. He walked forward to meet Thomas in the open space between the camp and the forest. Thomas dismounted, his legs shaking. He stood before the formidable chief, a simple farmer against a king. "My daughter," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I want my daughter back." Chief Kanji just looked at him, his dark eyes searching Thomas's soul. He gave a nod, and from behind him, Winona emerged, leading Clementine by the hand. Clementine was no longer crying. She was dressed in a soft deerskin tunic over her own clothes to keep her warm, and in her hand she clutched the small carved wooden horse. She saw her father, and her face lit up. "Papa!" She ran to him, and Thomas collapsed to his knees, wrapping her in his arms and burying his face in her wheat-colored hair. The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, it was physically painful. Up on the ridge, the posse watched in stunned silence. The girl was alive. She was unharmed. "See," Callahan sneered, recovering quickly. "A trick. They trot her out to make us lower our guard. Get ready to fire on my signal." But Felix Marchand was already riding down the path, determined to prevent a massacre. In the clearing, Chief Kanji approached the emotional reunion. He looked at Thomas, who was now standing holding his daughter's hand, as if he would never let go. The chief held up Clementine's blanket. He began to speak in Lakota. Winona, who had followed Clementine out, stood beside him and began to translate for Thomas and for Felix Marchand, who had just arrived. "He says, he is sorry for your fear," Winona said haltingly. "We did not steal your child. We honored her." And then, for the second time, the story of the blanket was told. The story of mourning dove, of the sacred raven sigil of a lost piece of their people's soul, returned by an innocent child. Kanji held the blanket out, showing the intricate pattern to Thomas. "This is my wife's spirit," he said, using the few English words he knew, his voice thick with a grief that spanned decades. Thomas stared at the blanket, then at the chief's solemn, grieving face, and finally understood. The gifts, the taking of his daughter, it was all a twisted, horribly misunderstood ceremony of gratitude. The shocking thing the tribe had done was not an act of violence, but an act of profound spiritual reverence. Up on the ridge, Callahan saw the talking was going on too long. His men were getting restless, their bloodlust cooling into confusion. He had lost control of the narrative. "To hell with this," he snarled. He raised his rifle, taking aim not at a warrior, but at the unarmed Chief Kanji, the man who was the very center of this fragile, emerging peace. "This ends now." He pulled the trigger. The rifle shot cracked through the cold, still air, a sound of pure sacrilege in the midst of the fragile truce. Time seemed to slow down. Thomas saw the puff of smoke from Callahan's rifle on the ridge. He saw Chief Kanji's eyes widen, not in fear, but in surprise. Instinct, raw and paternal, took over. Thomas shoved Clementine behind him, and without a second thought threw himself sideways, crashing into the Lakota chief. The two men hit the snowy ground in a heap, a tangle of farmer's wool and buckskin. The bullet whizzed through the space where Kanji's chest had been a second before, burying itself harmlessly in the trunk of a pine tree. The spell was broken. Chaos erupted. "Fire!" Callahan screamed from the ridge, his face contorted in a mask of fury. A volley of shots rained down on the camp. Lakota warriors, who had been holding their positions with disciplined restraint, now returned fire, a flurry of arrows and a few scattered rifle shots arcing up toward the posse. Women and children screamed and scrambled for the safety of their tipis. On the ground, Thomas helped a stunned Chief Kanji to his feet. The chief looked at him, his dark eyes wide with a new startling understanding. This white man, the father of the honored child, had just saved his life. "Get her to safety!" Thomas yelled at Winona, pushing Clementine toward her. Winona scooped up the girl and ran zigzagging toward the largest tipi arrows whizzing past her. The battle was a confusing, brutal affair. It was not the one-sided massacre Callahan had envisioned. The Lakota fighting on their home ground used the trees and terrain for cover their arrows, silent and deadly. The posse exposed on the ridge found themselves in a far more dangerous position than they'd anticipated. Chayton, who had watched the entire exchange with burning intensity, saw Thomas's selfless act. He saw his father saved not by a warrior, but by the very man he had viewed with such contempt. A conflict raged in his heart, but the immediate need for survival took precedence. He let out a piercing war cry and led a charge not up the main path, but flanking through the dense woods to the west, aiming to dislodge the shooters from their perch. Thomas, his mind unnervingly clear, knew he had to stop this. He grabbed the rifle from the scabbard of his horse, which had bolted in the initial panic. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a man defending his child, who was now trapped in the middle of a war he had inadvertently helped start. He looked up at the ridge and saw that the posse was not a unified force. Some men, stirred by Callahan's hate, were firing wildly, but others, having seen the girl, was safe having witnessed Thomas's attempt at peace, were hesitant. They were firing into the air, or not firing at all. Felix Marchand was one of them. "Hold your fire, you damn fools!" he roared, riding his horse along the line, trying to restore order. "This is murder." A bullet tore through the sleeve of Marchand's coat, fired by Jeb Callahan's brutish lackey. "Shut up, old man. You're either with us or against us." It was then that Thomas Garrison made his choice. He was no longer just a father trying to save his daughter. He was a man standing for what was right against what was easy. He raised his rifle, but he didn't aim it at the Lakota. He aimed it at the men on the ridge who were still firing on the village. He fired a shot not to kill, but to shock. The bullet kicked up snow right in front of Jeb's horse, causing it to rear violently. "Garrison's turned on us," Pete shrieked. "He's with the savages." The posse was now completely fractured. It was no longer settlers versus natives. It was Callahan's faction against Marchand's, with Thomas Garrison and the Lakota warriors fighting a common enemy. Chayton's flanking maneuver hit the south side of the ridge hard. Warriors burst from the trees, and the surprised settlers, including Pete and Jeb, broke ranks and fled in panic. The tide of the battle turned swiftly. Callahan, seeing his plan disintegrate, his authority vanished, was consumed by a black, murderous rage. He saw Thomas Garrison below the man who had ruined everything. He leveled his rifle for a second time, a deliberate killing shot. But as he aimed, a figure rose beside him. It was Felix Marchand, his face set in grim determination, his Colt revolver steady in his hand. "It's over, Ben." Callahan snarled and swung his rifle toward the Felix, but Marchand was faster. His shot was not a warning. The bullet caught Callahan in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his rifle, clutching the wound with a howl of pain and outrage. His reign of terror was over. The fighting subsided as quickly as it had begun. The routing of Callahan's men and the capture of their leader broke the posse's will. The hesitant settlers lowered their weapons, their faces a mixture of shame, fear, and relief. The silence that fell over the valley was heavy, punctuated by the groans of the wounded and the sobbing of a child from within one of the teepees. The snow was stained with blood from both sides. 2 Lakota warriors were dead, and several more wounded. Among the posse, 1 man lay dead, and a handful of others, including Callahan, were injured. It was a tragedy, but it was not the annihilation Callahan had wanted. Thomas stood in the center of the clearing, his rifle hanging limply at his side, his body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Clementine ran from the tipi straight into his arms. He held her, burying his face in her hair, his body racked with silent sobs. Chief Kanji approached them, his son Chaitan at his side. The chief's face was a mask of sorrow for his lost men, but his eyes, when they met Thomas's, held a deep, profound respect. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. No translation was needed. It was the touch of a fellow leader, a fellow father, a man who understood sacrifice. Chaitan, the fierce warrior, looked at Thomas, and the contempt was gone from his eyes, replaced by a grudging admiration. He gave a slight formal nod. An alliance had been forged in blood and misunderstanding, a bridge built between 2 worlds, where before there had only been a chasm of fear. Felix Marchand and the shame-faced remnants of the posse brought a bound and bleeding Ben Callahan down into the valley. Justice would be served not just for his incitement to violence, but for the attempted murder of the Felix himself. His hold over Redemption Creek was broken forever. There was no victory celebration. The cost was too high. The Lakota tended to their dead and wounded with quiet dignity. The settlers did the same, a gulf of shame and regret separating them from their former neighbors. Before Thomas and Clementine left, Chief Kanji performed one last ceremony. He stood before them holding Clementine's colorful blanket. He spoke to his people, his voice ringing with authority. Then he turned to Thomas. He says, Winona translated her voice soft, that the blanket has served its purpose. It was a memory of a wife, but it returned as a promise of a future. Its spirit is with our people now, in here. She touched her heart. Its body belongs with the one whose heart is pure enough to give it away. He folded the precious blanket and gently handed it back to a wide-eyed Clementine. Then he removed a beautiful necklace from around his own neck, a string of polished bone beads, and a single perfectly carved eagle feather, and placed it gently over Clementine's head. A gift for a gift. A life for a life. Thomas Garrison rode back to Redemption Creek not as an outcast, but as a leader. He had walked into the heart of fear and found not a monster, but a mirror. The town was changed, humbled by the consequences of its prejudice. The peace that followed was fragile, scarred, and built on the graves of the fallen. But it was a real peace, earned through the terrible honesty of violence and the surprising grace of forgiveness. The Garrison homestead no longer felt like a prison. It felt like home. And sometimes, in the quiet evenings, Clementine would sit by the fire, wrapped in her impossibly colorful blanket, touching the eagle feather necklace around her neck, a child who had seen the very worst and the very best of humanity, and who had, with a single act of kindness, rewritten the fate of them all. The story of Clementine Garrison and the raven's blanket, is a stark reminder that in the wild, untamed corners of our history, the most powerful force was never a rifle or a rope. It was the unpredictable, world-changing power of human connection. A child's empathy became a spark in the darkness, forcing two worlds on a collision course with destinies, revealing that our greatest enemies are often just our own fears reflected in the eyes of a stranger. The West was won and lost, not just with bullets, but with choices: the choice to hate, and the rarer, braver choice to understand. If this piece of hidden history moved you, please help us keep these stories alive. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true stories from the forgotten frontiers. Let us know in the comments what you think. Was Thomas Garrison a hero or a fool at the start? Your engagement helps us dig deeper into the past. Thank you for watching.